The courtroom was quiet when the bailiff called his name. Leonard Briggs. From the last row, a tall man in a wrinkled gray suit rose to his feet. He didn't rush. His steps were slow, steady, deliberate, like he had walked this path before. No lawyer beside him. No folder of papers. Just himself. Two officers sitting in the back leaned toward each other. "That him?" one whispered. "Gotta be." "Look at him," the other replied, trying to hold back a laugh. They smirked openly, mocking his silence, convinced he was just another man who thought he could outsmart the system. Leonard didn't react. His face stayed calm, unreadable. He walked down the aisle as the judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through the file. "Mr. Briggs," the judge said, voice steady but casual. "You're charged with failure to comply during a lawful stop. We'll keep this brief." The officers chuckled again, shaking their heads. To them, it was already decided. A small case. Another man standing alone, about to lose. But Leonard didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached slowly into his coat pocket. One officer shifted in his seat, ready to mock again. Leonard paused, then pulled out a slim laminated badge. He placed it gently on the judge's bench. The judge leaned forward. His words caught in his throat. "I'm Leonard D. Briggs," the man said quietly. "Director of Internal Affairs, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The sound of those words rolled across the room like thunder. The officers stopped laughing. The gallery froze. Even the air felt heavy. The courtroom that had been filled with whispers and chuckles just moments before fell into a silence so sharp you could hear a pin drop. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, but the truth of how Leonard Briggs got there started the night before. It was late evening on Highway 45. The road stretched out dark and empty, only broken by the glow of headlights. Leonard had been driving for hours in a rented silver Camry. Nothing about the car drew attention. That was the point. He never traveled flashy, never made himself a target. His day had been long. Small-town police departments, endless files and quiet conversations about complaints that never made it past the front desk. It was his job to look into places where things didn't add up. Departments where reports vanished or body cams malfunctioned too often. By the time he pulled onto the quiet stretch of highway, all he wanted was a cheap motel and a few hours of rest. Then came the lights, red and blue flashing in his rear view. He sighed softly, pulled to the shoulder, and waited. Two officers stepped out of the cruiser. Both white, both mid-30s, one with a shaved head, a flashlight already swinging in his hand. The other walked slower, circling to the passenger side. The bald one banged on the driver's window. "License and registration." No greeting. No explanation. Leonard rolled the glass down halfway. His voice was calm. "Officer, may I ask why I was stopped?" "You didn't signal at that last lane change," the officer snapped. "License, registration now." Leonard reached slowly, handed them over. His license was clean. No record, no issues. Just his real name. Nothing about who he really was. The second officer leaned closer to the passenger side. "Where are you headed?" he asked. Leonard kept his eyes forward. "Can't say." The man frowned. "Can't or won't?" "Federal protocol," Leonard replied evenly. Those two words changed the air. The bald officer narrowed his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You think you're above the law?" Leonard didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence only made them angrier. "Step out of the car," the first one barked. Leonard stayed still. "I haven't refused anything. I asked a question." "Out now." The passenger door yanked open. Rough hands grabbed him. They dragged him onto the gravel shoulder. His cheek pressed hard into the dirt. A knee dug into his back. His arm twisted until it burned. He didn't fight. He didn't shout. He simply stared at the stones under his face and listened. Every insult. Every word they spat out. He memorized it all. What they didn't know was that a tiny recorder in his coat pocket had been running since the moment those lights flashed. By the time they shoved him into the back of the cruiser, their story was already being written. Aggressive suspect, non-compliant, refused to give information. No mention of their force. No mention of the unnecessary violence at the station. It only got worse. They filled out the report quickly, as if they had done it many times before. The words almost seemed rehearsed. Leonard asked once for badge numbers. They smirked. One of them leaned close and said, Don't worry, you'll have plenty of time to ask questions in court. They locked him in a holding cell for the night. No call, no supervisor. Just a flickering light above and the echo of doors slamming shut down the corridor. The officer with the shaved head walked by once, smirking as if he had already won. Leonard sat on the hard bench, his back against the cold wall. He didn't let the anger rise. He didn't let his voice crack. Instead, he breathed slow, steady. Because he knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The holding cell was small, cold, and smelled faintly of bleach. Leonard sat quietly on the metal bench, his hands resting on his knees. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the hum of the flickering light above him. He wasn't new to situations like this. Over the years, he had seen what happened when power mixed with arrogance. He had read the reports, met the victims, and listened to stories told in whispers. Tonight, he was living one of those stories. The officers who dragged him in had walked away proud of themselves. In their minds, the paperwork had sealed the truth. They had written down a version of events where Leonard was verbally aggressive and refused to comply. They had framed him as difficult, as disrespectful, as a man who needed to be taught a lesson. The report was short, clean, and predictable, just the way they wanted it. But Leonard knew better. He had felt the gravel cut against his cheek. He had felt the twist in his arm. He had heard every word they muttered under their breath. And his recorder, still tucked inside his coat pocket, had captured it all. He leaned back against the wall, staring up at the ceiling. His body ached, but his face gave nothing away. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of anger. He wasn't going to let them see frustration. He had learned long ago that silence could be louder than shouting. Time crawled inside that cell. The night stretched on, each minute heavier than the last. At one point, the bald officer strolled past, glancing through the bars. He smirked, shaking his head as if to say, "Look at you now." Leonard held his gaze steady and calm. No words exchanged, just a quiet challenge. The hours blurred together. No one offered him water. No one asked if he needed to call someone. No supervisor came down the hall to check the arrest. It was as if the station itself had agreed to forget about him until morning. But Leonard did not forget. He replayed every detail in his mind. The knock on the window, the demand for his license, the phrase "federal protocol" that set them off, the moment they decided force was easier than respect. Every detail mattered. Every second would become part of the story they thought they controlled. As the night deepened, he thought about the people who had sat in cells like this before him. People without badges, without recorders, without a way to prove what happened. People whose voices were drowned by official reports stamped and filed away. They didn't get a chance to fight back. They didn't have anyone to believe them. By morning, Leonard was stiff but collected. His silence had unnerved the guards, though they tried not to show it. One officer muttered to another, "Guy hasn't said a word all night. Think he's scared?" The other shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Judge will take care of him." They were confident, too confident. What they didn't realize was that every step they took had already built the case against them. Their arrogance wasn't power. It was evidence. When the cell door finally opened and they told him he'd be in court that day, Leonard stood calmly. His suit was wrinkled, his face tired, but his presence steady. The officers laughed under their breath, mocking him again as they walked him toward the courtroom. They thought the story was almost over. But for Leonard Briggs, it was only just beginning. The courtroom was already half full when Leonard was led inside. Wooden benches creaked as people shifted, curious to see the day's cases. Most thought it was nothing unusual, a routine hearing, a minor charge. The hum of quiet conversations filled the space, mixing with the faint shuffle of papers from the clerk's desk. Leonard walked in alone. No lawyer beside him. No stack of documents to defend himself. Just a tired-looking suit and a calm, unreadable expression. He didn't glance around. He didn't search for sympathy in the faces that stared at him. He kept his eyes straight ahead, as if he had walked through rooms like this 1,000 times before. From the back, the two officers who had arrested him leaned together, their whispers carrying just enough to be noticed. "That's him," one muttered, smirking. "Bet he tries the old Sovereign Citizen Act," the other chuckled. "These guys always think the law doesn't apply to them." Their laughter was quiet but sharp enough to cut the silence around them. A few heads turned. Leonard didn't flinch. He let their words hang in the air like smoke. At the front, the judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through a thin file. His voice echoed through the room, practiced and calm like a man who had said these lines many times. Mr. Briggs, you're charged with failure to comply during a lawful stop. A minor violation. We'll keep this brief. He looked over the rim of his glasses. Do you have counsel present today? Leonard shook his head once. I don't need one. A few chuckles drifted from the back benches. The judge's eyes flicked toward the officers but didn't linger. He cleared his throat, tapping the file. Very well. Before we proceed, is there anything you'd like to say? The air shifted. Leonard stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate. His shoes clicked against the wooden floor. The tension thickened, but he remained steady, almost too calm. One of the officers sat up straighter, his hand brushing instinctively against his holster as Leonard reached into his coat pocket. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Then Leonard pulled out a small laminated badge. He placed it carefully on the judge's bench, the gesture quiet but heavy. I'm Leonard D. Briggs, he said, his tone low, steady, unwavering. Director of Internal Affairs, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words landed like thunder. The judge froze, staring down at the badge. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For the first time that morning, his confidence slipped. The clerk who had been scribbling notes looked up sharply, eyes narrowing as if she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. The officers in the back went pale. One leaned forward, whispering, "No way. This guy's playing us." But his voice trembled, betraying the doubt already sinking in. The judge finally spoke, though his words stumbled. You're with the FBI? Leonard didn't move. Not just the FBI, Internal Affairs. I oversee misconduct investigations across the southeastern region. His gaze swept briefly across the room, including departments where body cams fail at suspiciously convenient times. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The gallery, which moments earlier had watched with amusement, now sat frozen. Even a restless child in the back row had gone still. The judge cleared his throat, but his voice was no longer steady. Would you step into my chambers for a moment, Mr. Briggs? Leonard's reply was calm but sharp. No, I prefer everything stay on record. Full transparency. Whispers rippled through the room like a wave. The officers shifted uncomfortably. One of them muttered, barely audible, "We didn't know who he was." Leonard turned his head slightly, his eyes finding theirs. His voice stayed even, controlled. You didn't ask. The judge leaned back in his chair, visibly rattled. The clerk stood, almost eager to break the silence. Your Honor, would you like me to verify the badge? Yes, the judge said quickly, too quickly. As the clerk hurried out, the room seemed suspended in time. Every breath, every heartbeat, every flicker of movement felt magnified. The officers who had laughed only minutes ago now sat stiff, their faces drained of color. 5 minutes later, the clerk returned, her notepad clutched tightly in one hand. She looked at the judge, her voice clear, almost ringing. Confirmed. Leonard Briggs. Director of Internal Affairs, FBI, Southeastern Division. 27 years of service. The judge's face tightened. His eyes flicked toward the officers, then back to Leonard. The authority in the room had shifted completely, and everyone knew it. Leonard stepped back slightly, folding his hands in front of him. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. His voice carried a calm weight. I didn't come here to cause a scene, but I will not be silent while my rights or anyone else's are ignored. The judge hesitated, then nodded once. The charges against you are dropped. His words were clipped, his throat dry. Both officers will be placed on administrative leave. Effective immediately. The officers stared stunned, as if the ground had shifted under them. And in that moment, the courtroom that had once mocked him sat in a silence no one dared to break. When Leonard walked out of that courtroom, the silence still clung to the walls like smoke after a fire. The officers had gone pale. The judge was left shifting in his chair, and the gallery avoided eye contact as though they'd witnessed something dangerous. But for Leonard, this was only the surface. What had happened inside those four walls was dramatic, yes, but the real battle was waiting outside. The first step was simple. He filed for the body cam footage from the night of his arrest. He knew what the response would be, but protocol mattered. Within an hour, the department sent back a short defensive email. We regret to inform you that the footage from the incident on May 14th is unavailable due to a technical malfunction. Leonard almost smiled. Not out of amusement, but because it was so predictable. It was the same excuse he had read in dozens of reports. Body cams failing at the exact moment when force was questioned. Technology that worked fine during drills or routine traffic stops but mysteriously failed whenever someone claimed misconduct. He didn't need confirmation to know this wasn't an accident. That night, in a quiet motel room with his laptop open, Leonard typed up a request to his team in Washington. Within minutes, his secure line buzzed. A calm voice greeted him. "Tell me what happened." Leonard laid it out carefully, the stop, the aggression, the missing footage, the overnight holding. He didn't dramatize. He didn't exaggerate. He told it plainly, as he always did. When he finished, there was a pause on the other end. Then the voice said, "This isn't the first time from that department. We've had 3 complaints in the last year and a half. All dropped. One plaintiff even left the state." Leonard's jaw tightened. He had suspected a pattern. Now he had proof. "Then we make it official," he replied. "Bring in the team." 2 days later, the atmosphere at the Jefferson County Police Department shifted. 2 black SUVs pulled quietly into the rear lot. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just presence. Leonard stepped out first, the same gray suit on his shoulders, a manila folder in his hand. Behind him were 2 specialists from Washington. Grace Mendoza, sharp-eyed and unyielding, carried herself like a woman who had seen too many cover-ups to be fooled. Beside her was Nathan Cole, a digital forensics expert who spoke little but saw everything. Inside the department, silence greeted them. Officers who usually moved with swagger suddenly found themselves staring at their screens, their posture stiffer than usual. Everyone knew what it meant when Internal Affairs walked through the door. Grace went straight to the records room. "I need disciplinary files, traffic stop data, training records, and use of force protocols. Everything for the last 4 years." She spoke without hesitation, her tone leaving no space for excuses. Nathan disappeared into the server room with the department's IT technician, a nervous man named Brian. Within minutes, he was pulling logs, camera archives, and access records. He worked fast, copying data, reconstructing files that had been deleted. What the officers didn't realize was that nothing ever truly disappeared. Leonard, meanwhile, sat with Deputy Tamara Wells, one of the few who hadn't looked away during the courtroom incident. She pulled up old reports on her laptop, dozens of them. As she scrolled, her face grew tighter. "These all look the same," she said. Pulled over, accused of aggression, body cams off, vague write-ups. Then marked unfounded, no interviews, no follow-ups. Leonard leaned in, scanning the reports. "It's not about one bad decision," he said. "It's about culture. What gets ignored, what gets hidden. The system teaches them this is normal." Down the hall, Grace opened a dusty cabinet of training manuals. She flipped through them, her brow furrowing. "These are 4 years out of date," she muttered. "No current policies, no escalation protocols, nothing." At the same time, Nathan uncovered something bigger. Among the so-called missing files were fragments of body cam recordings. One was short, barely a minute, but the audio was clear. Leonard's calm voice, the officer's sharp command, the words "federal protocol," the sound of a door yanked open, and the thud of someone hitting gravel. It was enough. Nathan handed Leonard the headphones. Leonard listened quietly, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he set them down and said only one word. "Enough." He walked straight to the sheriff's office, where Grace was still flipping through folders. Sheriff Ricky Halburn looked up, his face pale and drawn. Leonard placed the folder on his desk. "As of today," he said, his voice even but firm, "your department is under compliance hold. No officer from this department participates in field operations until the review is complete." The sheriff leaned back, his jaw tight. "You're shutting us down?" "Temporarily," Leonard answered. "You'll keep dispatch running. Emergencies only, but field operations stop here until we're finished." The sheriff exhaled through his nose, his voice low. "You know what this will do to us?" Leonard didn't blink. "You know what not doing it already did." The door closed behind him as he walked out, and the department seemed to shrink in his wake. Officers glanced at him, some with fear, others with quiet relief. Because deep down everyone knew the truth, and the system had been broken for years. And now, for the first time, someone was here who wouldn't look away. This wasn't just about one arrest anymore. It was about every voice that had been silenced, every report that had been buried, and every camera that had failed at just the right time. The investigation had begun. News travels faster than paper, faster than reports, faster than truth even. By the time the FBI team had dug into their second day of files, the town had already begun to whisper. Coffee shops, barbershops, and church steps carried the same words, "Did you hear?" That man wasn't just some defendant. He was FBI. He was investigating them. At first, people didn't believe it. In a place like Jefferson County, whispers about corruption were common, but they rarely grew legs. Complaints vanished, stories stayed behind closed doors. But this time something was different. This time the man they dragged into court wasn't powerless. He had a badge, and that badge had cracked open a door no one had dared push against. By Thursday night, a notice went out. An emergency town hall at the community center. The small hall wasn't built for large crowds, but by sunset every seat was filled. People stood along the walls and the doorways, even spilling out into the parking lot. Mothers with tired eyes, fathers who clenched their jaws. Teenagers leaning against the back wall, arms folded, trying to act casual but listening intently. The mayor stood at the podium, his hands shaking as he adjusted the microphone. "We're aware of the federal inquiry," he began, his voice thin. "And we want you to know the city is cooperating fully." From the crowd, a woman's voice rose, clear and unafraid. "Cooperating isn't enough." Heads turned. She stood tall, her arms crossed. "2 years ago, my son filed a complaint. He was roughed up 3 blocks from home. They said his story didn't add up. They marked it unfounded. Is anyone reopening that file?" The mayor's lips tightened. We're looking into it." "No," the woman snapped. "Don't look, act." Applause erupted, scattered at first, then stronger. People who had stayed silent for years felt the crack in the wall widening. A teenage boy took the mic next, his voice shaking but steady. "I was stopped walking home from football practice. They asked if I was carrying. I wasn't. They made me empty my bag on the street in front of everyone." His voice broke. They laughed. Murmurs spread through the hall, some angry, some sorrowful. Then an older man stepped forward, gray hair, back slightly bent. He cleared his throat. "In 1989, he said slowly, I was pulled over. They cuffed me, pushed me against the hood of my car, and let me go without a word. I never told anyone. What was the point? No one would believe me." The room went silent. For the first time, stories that had lived in shadows were finding air, and once spoken, they could not be stuffed back into silence. Leonard stood near the back of the hall, arms crossed, listening. He hadn't come to speak. He came to watch, to see if the community would rise or if fear would keep them seated. He didn't take notes. He didn't record. He simply listened because this wasn't his voice to lead. It was theirs. Halfway through the meeting, Sheriff Ricky stepped hesitantly toward the mic. The room quieted instantly. His shoulders slumped, his face tired. He looked more like a man carrying a burden than a sheriff holding authority. "I've been in this job 31 years, he began, and I'd be lying if I said I haven't failed some of you. We didn't know who Mr. Briggs was when we arrested him. But that's not the problem." His eyes swept across the crowd. "The problem is we didn't care who any of you were." Gasps, murmurs, even a few nods. The honesty cut through the tension like a blade. He cleared his throat. "We're going to reopen old complaints. We'll work under federal oversight. Anyone who buried evidence or ignored misconduct will be held accountable, including me." From the front row, a woman shouted, "Talk is cheap!" Ricky didn't flinch. "Then hold me to it." The hall erupted again, half cheers, half doubtful mutters. Change was never clean, never instant, but the words had been said aloud, and that mattered. Tamara, the deputy who had quietly aided Leonard, leaned against the wall near him. She whispered, "Didn't think this many people would show up." "They always do," Leonard replied softly, when they stopped being afraid of the silence. The meeting stretched late into the night. People shared, vented, demanded. No banner was hung, no decision fixed everything, but a shift had begun. For the first time in years, the community felt seen. When the crowd spilled outside into the humid night, clusters formed in the parking lot. Conversations didn't end at the door. They continued under streetlights, over car hoods, across fences. Something had broken open and no one could force it closed again. Leonard stood quietly at the edge, hands in his pockets, watching. He wasn't there for thanks and he didn't need applause. He only needed to know the silence had finally been shattered. Because once voices rise, once truth finds air, there's no putting it back in the box. And this town, this time, had finally decided to speak. The town hall meeting was only the beginning. By Monday morning, the ripples had reached City Hall. Leonard walked up the stone steps with a folder under one arm and a black coffee in the other. He didn't look like a man carrying headlines. He looked like a man carrying truth, and truth weighed more than any badge. Inside, the mayor sat stiffly at a long oak table. Beside him was Sheriff Ricky, worn down but sober, his hands clasped tightly together. Tamara Wells, now officially reassigned as a liaison for federal oversight, sat to Leonard's left. Grace Mendoza, sharp as ever, sat on his right, a stack of folders at her elbow. The air smelled of coffee and unease. Leonard didn't waste time. He laid the folder on the table and opened it. "These are the preliminary findings," he said calmly. 5 confirmed policy violations, 3 cases of falsified reporting, 2 instances of body cam tampering, and 1 active attempt to obstruct a federal investigation. The mayor shifted in his seat, his voice thin. "Are you recommending prosecution?" Leonard didn't answer immediately. His gaze moved to Grace. She gave the smallest nod, then opened her own folder. "We are recommending a full personnel audit, effective immediately, and the removal of Officer Curtis Dell for tampering with evidence." The mayor exhaled, his hands tightening on the table's edge. "You're asking me to fire one of our senior patrol officers." Leonard's voice stayed calm, steady. "We're asking you to restore trust in a system that's been broken for years." Tamara leaned forward, her tone firm but even. "You can protect one man who buried complaints and erased footage, or you can stand with the community that finally spoke up." The room went silent. No spin, no statement, no excuse could soften what had been said. The mayor's shoulders sagged. He nodded slowly. "I'll issue the termination letter today." The matter closed with no applause, no celebration. Just a tired nod from Leonard as he gathered the papers back into his folder. He had no interest in grandstanding. The work wasn't about him. It was about the people who had filled that town hall, the ones who had carried silent burdens for years. By the end of the week, change had begun in small but steady ways. New protocols were drafted, mandatory body cam audits, independent review boards, open complaint systems that could not be buried by a single signature. Training manuals were updated. Files were reopened. For the first time in decades, accountability wasn't just a word written in policy, it was being practiced. Inside the department, the mood was divided. Some officers carried resentment in their stares. Others, quietly relieved, seemed to walk lighter, as though the weight of silence had finally lifted. Tamara moved through the halls like a steady anchor, her presence a reminder that eyes were finally watching, and this time they weren't looking away. As for Curtis Dell, the officer who had smirked at Leonard's silence, his termination came swiftly. No ceremony, no chance to explain. He left through the back door, a box of belongings in his arms. The same officers who once followed his lead now turned away. For him, the story had ended the same way it had begun, with silence. But for the town, silence had been broken. One evening, Leonard walked through the square before leaving. The sun was low, painting the brick buildings in shades of gold. Families were out. Children ran across the grass. In one corner, a group of high school students leaned against a wall, their voices carrying laughter and talk of football practice. One boy in a blue hoodie looked up and saw Leonard. He gave a small nod. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. Just acknowledgement, respect. Leonard returned the nod and kept walking. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need recognition. What mattered was that the boy didn't look away. Back at his motel, Leonard packed his bag with the same quiet care he always did. The phone on the nightstand buzzed with a secure call. He answered, his tone steady. "Send me the next location." There was a pause on the line. "Already?" "Already," Leonard replied, because this wasn't the end. It was one chapter in a longer story, a story about silence, power, and what happens when truth refuses to stay buried. As he loaded his bag into the car, Leonard thought not of himself, but of the people whose names had filled the files he carried. The mother who had cried in the parking lot of that town hall. The boy who emptied his backpack on the street. The old man who finally spoke after 30 years. They didn't have badges. They didn't have recorders. They only had their voices. And now finally someone had listened. The road stretched ahead, dark but open. Leonard turned the key, the engine hummed, and he drove off, not for recognition, not for praise, but for the quiet, steady belief that justice, though late, was still worth chasing, and sometimes, The most powerful change doesn't come from the noise of anger. It comes from the silence that follows. The silence when a courtroom stops laughing. The silence when a community refuses to look away. The silence that demands, not asks, demands that truth be heard. Leonard Briggs didn't need to be a hero. He only needed to do his job. Fully, honestly. And in a world too quick to dismiss the quiet man in the back row, that was enough.